Hello and welcome to another episode of What the Field. I am Roman.
And I'm Emmeline.
Today we're joined by Garance Boullenger from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. Garance, thank you so much for being with us today. It's an honor to have you.
Yes, so today we're going to be talking about plastics, about the pros, the cons, and everything related to it, recycling, the alternatives, etc. So we have invited you. Maybe you could tell us a bit about your background and why we came to you to talk about this particular topic with.
Yeah, so who are you and what does the Ellen MacArthur Foundation do?
Yes, sure. Hi, Emmeline. Hi, Roman. So, I'm Garance Boullenger. Thanks so much for having me here on the podcast. Super glad to be here. As you mentioned, so I'm a project manager in the plastics initiative here at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. I have a background in business management and I've experience working in sustainability departments with different corporates, previous to joining the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. And so today I'm joining you from London and not the sunny Spain. So regarding the foundation, as its name says very well, it's been created by Ellen MacArthur. And so for those who don't know her, she's an English sailor who in 2005 set a world record for the fastest solo non-stop around the world tour on her first attempt. And she was very young when she did that. So you'll be thinking, that's great, but what does it have to do with the circular economy?
Indeed.
And plastics? Well, when she was on her boat, actually, she had this intuition. And so obviously the resources that she had taken with her on the boat were limited and finished. And so she had to manage them very carefully, obviously. And so she realized that, she just realized what finite really means. And she thought that our global economy actually is no different. We also have a certain amount of natural resources that we need to manage very carefully. And so when she arrived at the end of her solo world tour, she realized that the way that our economic model is designed, so taking materials from the earth, making products out of them, and then throwing them away as a waste, is set up to fail. And so that's how the journey of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation started, and that was back in 2010. And so the Ellen MacArthur Foundation is a charity. We're based in the UK, actually on the Isle of Wight, south of the UK. And the mission of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation is to accelerate the transition to a circular economy. So we develop and promote the idea of a circular economy. We engage key actors such as businesses, policymakers, academia, etc. And then we mobilize system solutions in different sectors, plastics, the one that I work for, fashion, and food, for example.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so this is quite extensive, the whole aspect, the spectrum of topics you're working on in the circular economy. But today we're here to talk about plastic. I would love to talk about the other topics as well someday,
maybe
right?
Another time.
But not.
We need to focus.
That's it. That's it. So maybe we should just start with the basics. It seems quite obvious, but maybe you could tell us from your perspective what the main issues with plastic actually are. Like, why have we decided that plastic is evil? And also, why are we still using it? So what are the advantages of plastic that still make it one of the most used materials today?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I could spend just hours talking about it. So plastic, I think you said it very well. It kind of became the devil of that take, waste, linear economy that I was just talking about. It's very much an iconic example of that linear economy. But what we tend to forget is that plastics are great materials, right? They protect our food, they make our cars lighter, they insulate our homes. We can do so many different things with plastics, right? So that's the aspect that we can't forget. But unfortunately, the system in which these materials are used is still predominantly linear. And I'll just give you a few figures to illustrate that. So every year we use around 80 million tons of plastic packaging. However, we still only collect 14% of all plastic packaging for recycling. And there's only a super small proportion that goes back into a closed loop, and so back to packaging, which means that basically the rest is lost to the environment. So that's 40% of the plastics packaging that we use that ends up in landfill, and a third of plastic packaging that escapes collection system and leaks to the environment. So that leads to the equivalent of one garbage truck being dumped in the ocean every minute. So that's massive and definitely a linear kind of model. And the problem is that the use of plastics has increased 20-fold in the past 50 years and is expected to double again in the next 20 years. So, the big question that we're asking ourselves is if our system and the system that we have today to manage this plastic packaging waste cannot cope with the waste that we have today, how will it cope with it tomorrow when the volumes will actually have doubled? So that's a bit the situation that we're in now. And I can talk to you a bit later about how we think we should transition to a new system.
And Garance, why should we worry about this? Is this directly related to global warming, for example?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, so I think there are, obviously, when we talk about global warming, very often we talk about CO2 emissions, which is one aspect and one kind of like one of the many crises, right, that we're confronted to. And the other kind of very often we talk about the three crises of the global warming, CO2 emissions, biodiversity, but also pollution crisis. So, and plastics is really interesting because it's related to all of them. But regarding the link between plastics and greenhouse gases emission, so in a report a couple of years ago, we showed that, when we talk about emissions, greenhouse gas emission, 55% of these emissions are related to the energy that we produce and that we consume. And so here, obviously, for these 55%, we need to shift to renewable energy. That's a part of the key solution. But when we look at the other 45% of the emissions, these are linked to our material economy, so the way that we produce and use products and foods. And here, really, for this 45%, the circular economy is really key. And plastics are part of this. So obviously, almost all plastics today are made from oil. And so if we don't shift to a circular economy, the plastics industry alone will use 15 to 20% of our carbon budget by 2050. So it is clear that we need a circular economy for plastics, right? Because obviously completely not aligned with the Paris Agreement trajectory.
Mm-hmm. I see. So what is the Ellen MacArthur Foundation vision of a circular economy for plastics? How do you plan to address it? Or how do you suggest to do it?
Yes, so that's what I like to talk about most, definitely. So in 2016, when we started working on plastics, we thought about this key question, right? That's what guided us, I think, and that's what made us really go into plastics. This was, what could a circular economy for plastics look like? And at the time, really, we had no clue, right? And so we started from what I just described to you, so the status of the linear plastics economy as it is today, and we tried to imagine and envision what 2025, 2030 vision could look like. Mm-hmm. So what is our vision? So in an economy which would be circular, first of all, the volume of plastic packaging put on the market is smaller. So we eliminate the plastic packaging that we don't need. And also we eliminate the plastic packaging that is problematic, right? Because we know that currently there is too much plastic packaging on the market. And so we're not able to close the loop and have a circular economy that works. So we need to reduce and we need to simplify the packaging that is put on the market. That's the first thing, eliminating. The second point is that we need to innovate. So that's the plastics that we do put on the market, because that's the plastics that we need, because there will always be a proportion of plastics that we will need. So we need to innovate so that plastics is actually reusable, recyclable, or compostable. And so it is designed to fit a circular economy. So it's designed in a way that, it can't be lost to the environment. So that's the second part, the innovation. And then we need to circulate the plastic packaging. So not only the plastic packaging needs to be theoretically reusable or recyclable, but the system needs to be in place so that plastic packaging is actually effectively either reused or recycled in practice. And very important point I'd like to underline is that in our vision, we talk very often about recycling as like the key word that comes to mind when we think about circular economy. But actually, we know very well that we won't recycle our way out of the plastic pollution crisis, right? Recycling is a part of the solution, but it's not the only solution. And we need elimination and reuse strategies to actually come before recycling as part of a comprehensive, circular economy strategies.
Okay, so that's the vision, but what state are we in today? Or like, what is the status quo, so to say, the status of what you call the plastic system today? Like how much is still used, in what state, or like how far along are we on the path to fulfilling this vision of yours? You already said that I think only 14% is being recycled currently. How recyclable, like how much recycling potential is there still to fulfill, or to make do on? And are there any new advancements that are helping us? Yeah. So.
That's a big question.
The big question I was gonna say.
And I can talk a little bit later about the different initiatives that we have also here at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. But before going into that, maybe keeping that kind of like systems helicopter view on what the systems look like today. So I think, and actually you mentioned something really interesting, right, around what's the status also around recycling and recyclability. So maybe I can also pick up on this question in particular. So one, I mean, and obviously I told you just earlier about, how much we produce and how little is recycled today. And so one key thing that we did when we started working on plastics back in 2016 was actually looking at the definitions, right? And what do we mean actually when we talk about recycling, recyclability, etc., right? So like just to make sure that everyone that we work with actually speaks the same language. And recyclability is a really interesting one. So because there was no common definition back in 2016 of what recyclability looks like. So, we can't talk about progress and advancement until we've actually defined a common definition for something. And so when we talk about recyclability, that can mean, recyclability in a lab. So my material that I've produced in a lab is theoretically recyclable. But actually, the definition that we at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation wants to use with the network that we work with is the idea of recyclability in practice and at scale. So not only the idea that recyclability needs to work theoretically, but also that on the ground in your country, in your region, there is actually a system, so a system of collection and of recycling that allows your packaging to be effectively recycled. So that's on the definition side of things, and it's the same for reuse, right? Back in 2016, there was no common definition of reuse. So the first effort that we did was really to upskill everyone on, okay, what are we actually talking about? And so regarding recycling, and that's a key part of, like the advancement that we talk about today. So in the last 40 years, since the introduction of the recycling symbols, it's really interesting because recycling rates have been incredibly low and progress is quite slow, right? So currently only around 14% of plastic packaging is collected for recycling globally, and only 2% is being recycled back to packaging. So without fundamental redesign and innovation, we know that around 30% of plastic packaging will never be reused or never be recycled.
But sorry to interrupt you, but could you maybe, just as a parenthesis, explain why that is? Why of the 14% that ends up in the correct container, let's say, and is picked up by the correct people and brought to recycling facility, let's say, why is then only, I think you said 2% of those 14% being recycled?
2% being recycled back to packaging. So 2% being, for example, recycled from a bottle to a bottle, which means that the rest is actually not of a high enough quality to be recycled into packaging. And so usually what happens is what we call downcycling, where your packaging that you have thrown into the bin actually doesn't get recycled as a packaging because the quality is too low, but gets recycled, for example, as a bin or bench in a park, like all these kind of things that we call downcycling because it doesn't go back to being packaging for products.
So is it is, so does that then mean, I'm just thinking as a consumer, because we have these, I don't know, shampoo bottles or whatever, where it has this little green symbol and it says recyclable. So is my conclusion now, and you need to tell me if I'm correct, does it mean that only plastic packaging that has this symbol and that says that it's recyclable is actually recyclable, and all of the other, like yogurt containers, whatever you have, their plastics are, as you say, less quality plastic or whatever, and thus not recyclable?
So this what you're talking about and the different signs that are on plastic packaging are actually very different from country to country. And from even region to region, right? So what gets recycled, for example, or what is considered as recyclable in Spain is not the same as in France or in the UK, etc. So that is going to vary a lot. But the thing I think you have to remember as a consumer is that, again, this difference between theoretically recyclable and recyclable in practice in a scale, right? And so sometimes it happens that on your packaging, you can get a sign that says recyclable. It doesn't mean that your packaging is going to be effectively recycled in practice. Some of it will, some of it won't. It's really hard, you know, like there is little transparency on exactly, you know, like how much gets recycled, etc. Like we have little data on that. But yeah, so I think as a consumer, there's also kind of like an education piece to have around that and around, you know, what is it that is actually recyclable and then recycled in practice, if that makes sense.
I just wanted to touch on that because we as consumers are often misinformed about how many times is this plastic going to be able to be recycled. Or I remember back in the day when I used to live in the UK and I moved from Edinburgh to London, the recycling guidelines were completely different. And this was alien to me because having been born and raised in Spain, we had the same recycling guidelines all over the country. And then you think about it, it makes a lot of sense because you don't have the same facilities in Edinburgh, in London, in Madrid or Barcelona. And you need to adapt to more local.
I think a very interesting thing to remember is that when we talk about a circular economy, we don't really talk about a circular product, but we talk about a circular system, because some things such as like packaging, but that's also the same for clothes or food or whatever, is not, you know, your packaging that is circular per se, but it's circular only if the system around it actually exists and allows it to circulate.
Exactly.
But that can be either, you know, like reuse systems or recycling systems.
But is it not true that I heard at least somewhere that plastic can only be recycled up to 4 times anyway? So it's not like endlessly circular in that sense, because it has like a limited lifespan in the sense that it cannot be endlessly reused.
Yeah. So that, again, that also, so I think there are 2 different things, right? Like and 2 different things that we talk about. The first one is reuse and the reuse of your plastic packaging. So that's, for example, when you know, a system where your packaging, for example, your PET bottle, like your Coca-Cola bottle or whatever, doesn't need to be recyclable, but it's collected to be reused. So which means that it's going to be washed and then refilled with another product, the same product, and then sold to the consumer again. So that's one, you know, pathway for circulation is reuse. And then obviously there is recycling, which, you know, we all know what recycling is, right? So like collected, recycled, and then transformed in another either packaging or object, as we talked about before. And as you say, I think there is a high consideration to have around also the durability of the packaging, of the your plastic packaging, because not all plastic packaging has the same durability and can be recycled the same amount of times. But ultimately, as you say, you know, the more you recycle it, the less, you know, quality it keeps. And therefore, you know, it's not, there is no kind of, today, there is no plastic packaging that can be endlessly recycled.
I wanted to talk a little bit about the concept of biodegradable, and your thoughts about it, because I mean, many consumers perceive it as a great alternative. Is it, oh, it's biodegradable, it's going to go in nature and nothing's going to happen. Is that actually true, or shall we be concerned about, for example, microplastics?
Yeah. Okay. So that's a really interesting question, actually. So the first thing is that, so there are 2 different things. So, you know, when you talk about biodegradable, and the reason why I want to clarify this, because sometimes it can lead to confusion. Sometimes we mix different terms. So there is bioplastics, something that we talk about is bioplastics, and then the other thing we talk about is biodegradable, right? Bioplastics tells you something about where the packaging comes from, so what materials have been used to produce it. So these are packaging, for example, that come from, you know, like starch, or, you know, like vegetable or bio-based materials, bioplastics. So, and that tells you something about, you know, the material that they have been produced with, but that doesn't tell you anything about its end of life, right? So that doesn't tell you anything about the fact that it can be either recycled or composted or reused. It tells you nothing. Whereas biodegradable tells you something about the end of life of the product, right? And not about where it comes from. So a biodegradable material can be made of many different things and not always bio-based materials. But so it tells you something about its end of life. And usually we actually rather use the term compostable, because the term compostable is defined very clearly by, for example, like ISO guidelines, etc., ISO standards, whereas the term biodegradable doesn't tell you anything about the specific conditions in which the packaging can biodegrade, whereas compostable tells you something about, you know, like the temperature, the conditions, the moisture, etc., that the packaging needs to be in to be composted, basically. Exactly. So that's the first thing. And then, so the second thing is that, you know, we would always prefer keeping them in a vision for a circular economy. We would always prefer keeping the material in the economy somehow. So by models such as reuse or recycling, instead of having it kind of like lost to the environment, although it biodegrades or it's composted. So with compostable materials. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that in some very specific cases, it actually does make sense to use compostable materials, because it's cases where using compostable packaging can help you to bring back some nutrients to the earth. Yep. And so, for example, in the case of tea sachets, or you know, like a label on a fruit or something, basically things that are very likely to end up anyway in your food compost, and where having another type of plastic could, you know, disturb the composting process. So that's where it actually makes sense to use, you know, compostable plastics. And then the other thing to say is that it is also very complicated, because when you use compostable plastics, sometimes compostable plastics, if it ends up in recycling streams, it can actually disturb the recycling streams. So that's where you also need to be very careful about, do you have the right systems in place? Do you have the right, you know, guidance for consumers for what to put in the compostable bin, what to put into the recycling bin? So there are also a lot of considerations to have about what your system looks like and how it helps consumers to actually do the right thing and put the packaging in the right place, if you want.
But would you say that there are good alternatives to plastic, like bioplastics or whatever it is? Because we have heard from other people who've come on the podcast that actually they've tried, like people in the food industry, for example, that they've tried changing up their plastic packaging using some alternatives, and then studying the alternative, they realized that it was actually worse in terms of environmental footprint.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and that's also a complicated question, to be honest. And I think, you know, if we're thinking in terms of material alternatives, so, you know, not looking only at plastics, not looking only at compostable plastics, but also looking at, you know, paper, aluminium, glass, etc. So alternative materials. I think, you know, what I can say is that there is no blanket solution. So like there is no one solution that makes sense for all the cases. And for example, when you think about paper, obviously it doesn't come from fossil fuels, but it comes from forests. And so switching all plastics to paper also wouldn't make sense, right? Because there are also some sourcing considerations, etc., that you need to have. Again, I think for some specific uses, as I was just talking about for the compostable plastics, there are some specific uses where it makes sense to switch to some alternatives. But in general, what I would say is, whichever material we use, we need to think about the exact same circular economy principles, right? And so that elimination as much as possible, direct elimination where packaging is not needed, but also innovative eliminations, for example, moving to reuse models, etc., where it is needed, where we do need to have packaging still. And then obviously having the same question and reflection on the end of life, right? So like whatever packaging you use, it will need to be designed to be reusable or recyclable. And finally, again, same considerations about the system for circulation. So either, you know, effective system for reuse or recycling that needs to be in place to allow for effective circulation and no leakage to the environment.
Are you, as the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, working on any initiatives to actively reduce plastic pollution?
Yes, we do, definitely. So on top of working on this vision, of what a circular economy for plastic looks like, we engage with the plastic system and with many different stakeholders in the system to bring this vision to life. And so our flagship initiative, which is called the Global Commitments, was launched in 2018 in partnership with UNEP, so the UN Environmental Programme. And so the Global Commitment unites more than 450 organizations, so from across all the plastics value chain. So that's plastics producer, brands, retailers, etc., plastics recyclers. And all of these different stakeholders have endorsed our common vision of the circular economy and have endorsed also the definitions that are underpinning this vision. And really, and also these stakeholders have committed to a set of concrete 2025 targets, and they publicly report on this set of targets every year. And I can tell you a bit more about, the progress that we're seeing. But really, with this initiative, the idea was to put everyone around the same table and really start a dialogue around, okay, how can we all progress together? Because what we realize is also that sometimes, all these stakeholders actually don't speak to each other. And so on top of these, kind of like business stakeholders, we also brought policymakers to the table, as well as different NGOs. And so really working all together to reach these targets. And just the only other thing to add is that on the back of this global initiative, because so the global commitment is an initiative at the global level, we also launched in 2018 what we call the Plastics Pact Network. So working in collaboration with a number of different NGOs and starting in the UK initially, but now this network expanded to 12 countries or regions across the world. And basically what these initiatives are very similar to the global commitment. So gathering, uniting business stakeholders, policymakers, and NGOs, but this time at the local level. So for example, in South Africa, in Australia, New Zealand, in Chile, in France, really gathering everyone at the local table, at the local level, at the regional level, around the same table to discuss concrete solutions and move forward to reach the targets that they've committed to.
It sounds like a super ambitious project. How are you able to track all the progress? And you mentioned that some of the actors you work with engage in reporting. Are you actually able to audit everything they say?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So the global commitments and the Plastics Pact initiative, so all of these different initiatives run an annual reporting. And so on the back of this annual reporting, we're able to publish an annual progress where, we take really this independent look with this critical perspective on the progress that all of these different stakeholders have made towards their 2025 targets. And so if we take the global commitment, for example, they have 5 different targets around elimination of problematic and unnecessary plastic packaging, moving from single-use to reuse plastic packaging. Again, the design of plastic packaging to be 100% reusable, recyclable, or compostable, recycled content targets, and virgin plastics reduction targets. So this is really the set of targets that all these different organizations report against. And maybe I can tell you a little bit about the progress that we're seeing, so far. So we launched the Global Commitment Initiative back in 2018. And so we published last year, so I think our 4th report evaluating really the progress of these organizations. And from this report, we're seeing, some great success stories, such as the increase in recycled content in plastic packaging that has doubled over the past 3 years. And also we've mobilized, are on track to eliminate 9 million tons of new virgin plastics from the market by 2025. So these are, the great success stories that we have and that we're seeing from initiatives such as the Global Commitments. But also what we're seeing is that on other fronts, the companies that we work with are still lagging. And especially on the front where we require system change as not just incremental changes, right? So what we're seeing is that, for example, recyclability doesn't increase so much because of formats like flexible plastic packaging. So flexible plastic packaging is like your salad sachet, your like rice pasta sachet, all this, or like your crisp sachet. You use them every day, but actually these plastic packaging today are not or very little actually recycled in practice. So these are the kind of like obstacles that makes it really hard to reach that target of 100% of recyclable packaging.
Yep.
And the other thing that we're seeing is that the overall volume, so reuse is increasing only a bit, but it's actually very, very slow. And finally, the overall volumes of plastic packaging that are put on the market had started to decrease in the past few years, but now last year actually increased again. So this is also kind of a concern for us at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. So all of that reinforces the need for action, really urgent action from businesses, and especially really on reuse and flexible plastic packaging, where we do see that these two areas, we need to see way more action in the coming years. And finally, the last thing is that all of this is happening in the context of a global plastics treaty that has started to be negotiated at the global level, and the negotiations are led by the UN and UNEP. And what we're seeing is that all of this, data that we're seeing from the Global Commitment Initiative also reinforces the need for strong regulation frameworks. We know obviously that voluntary action alone is not enough, and obviously through initiatives such as the global commitment, we're showing that commitment is possible. We're gathering more and more data. We're creating transparency on the problem, which was not done before. And we're also showing kind of like success stories, best practices, but that obviously won't replace for a regulation framework. And so with this UN Plastics Treaty being negotiated at the moment, this could change, and we could see more ambitious, stronger regulation framework put in practice. So hopefully with all the lessons that we've learned also from the Paris Agreement, from the different COP conferences that happen every year, there is a potential really for faster and stronger regulation in the plastic space. So that's really what we're hoping for and what we're trying to contribute to in the next few months.
And maybe it's a stupid question, but how come that even though consumers are increasingly boycotting plastics and there's been so many efforts to come up with like bioplastics or alternative materials that are not even trying to be plastic but are simply just another material, how come we are still using so much plastic? How come we're still seeing so much plastic everywhere? Is it only because of the price?
I think definitely the price is a key element, but also I think so far we've been staying in that space of incremental changes, so incorporating a bit more recycled content here and there, making the plastic packaging a bit more recyclable, investing in recycling systems, whereas actually we need to think differently and adopt a completely different mindset to design that circular economy that we want, right? And so that really starts with elimination and reuse, and I won't repeat that enough, right? Like this is also where we need to see more efforts. And when we talk about elimination, right, it can seem very easy to do, right? And for some examples, it is quite easy to do. There are examples of what we call direct elimination, where it's just about taking your plastic packaging out, like we actually don't need that, we're actually using too much, so we're just going to remove it. And there are a lot of examples of that happening, and this is great. But when we talk about elimination, we also need to talk about more innovative elimination, right? And so more innovative elimination, that means also designing your products in a different way so that you don't need the plastic packaging. So there are a couple of examples that I really like. One comes from Lush, and I think most people are familiar with it, which is basically redesigning your shampoo so that it doesn't have to be a liquid in a plastic bottle, but it can be solid and it can not need packaging actually. So that's a way to redesign completely your product so that you don't need plastic packaging. And that also means that, not only you're redesigning your product, but also you have to completely rethink your marketing strategy, your communication strategy, because you don't have the packaging anymore to communicate to your consumers, right? So that also opens a whole space of innovation. So that's one example that I really like. Another example that I really like is, for example, I'm sure you're familiar with it. When you buy like a Samsung phone, you would usually get a plug, so to charge it.
Yep.
And so that small plug, very often, it's actually wrapped in a very thin, flexible plastic packaging. Plastic layer. And so Samsung actually, they've realized that if they would just design that plug, that charger differently, and actually have it being matte instead of kind of like shiny, they wouldn't even need the small plastic thing around it, right? So like that's what we called innovative elimination, where it's not only about just removing your plastic where you don't need it, but it's also about creating a different product so that we don't even need the plastic packaging in the first place. And I think, yes, so I think to your question, I think it's, again, we've stayed in that space of incremental changes, but kept the system and the products as kind of like in a business as usual mindset, whereas actually we need fundamental redesign of our products, our packaging, and our system to allow for more elimination, but also more reuse systems to work in practice and at scale.
I think this is true for a lot of things, like even
everyday
fashion,
life,
etc. Yeah. So not just plastic. I think this is applicable to the whole economic system.
Yeah.
So very, very interesting thought. Roman, do you have...
I think we're running out of time.
Yeah, as
unfortunately.
Always. It was so interesting.
But this was fascinating, Garance.
Maybe we need a part 2.
Indeed. And maybe talk about another of the initiatives of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation would also be very nice. But Garance, I really want to thank you for your time today. This was eye-opening. I learned so much about the world of plastics. And I'm going to think a lot next time I go to the supermarket or go buy something that I probably don't need.
Yeah, good point. And thank you also for to our audience for listening in to another episode, for taking this little field trip through all the plastics with us. And yeah, goodbye and until next time.
Bye, everyone.